We're recording this session so we can share it around a bit more widely. So if you don't want to have your face in a recording, just turn off your camera. And it's so beautiful to see you all. Welcome. Ko te pū, te more, te weu, te aka, te rea, ko te waunui, te kuni, te whē, te kore, te pō. Ki ngā tangata Māori nā rangiraua ko papa, ko tēnei te timatanga o te ao. Welcome everyone. I pay respect to Rangitane, the tangata whenua of the place where I sit, and acknowledge that this is stolen land where sovereignty was never ceded. Naomi, our guest speaker, who is in our neighbouring Australia, I'll just hand over to her to give us a land acknowledgement.
Yes, I'd like to acknowledge I'm joining the meeting on Widjabul Waiable country of the Bundjalung Nation. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, emerging, and also say that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Good, thanks, Naomi. And kia ora, welcome everyone. Yeah, when we first made this Facebook event for this talk on Saturday, I had only heard 2 people mention this might possibly be a climate crisis event. That was Chloe Swarbrick and Kim Hill when she asked Mayor Wayne Brown about that, and we all know what he said. Probably no, we don't want to talk about that. And since then, a few days have passed, of course, and as the damage and the loss is assessed, as loved ones and loved places are grieved for, as the mammoth cleanup begins, and of course, still in red and orange alert in many places, the news is now filling up with what many of us have been talking about for decades, that these extreme weather events, these flooding events in Tāmaki Makaurau are indeed climate disasters, and our hearts go out to those who are grieving, for those who have died, those who have lost their homes, and to everyone affected. We want to acknowledge that this is an ongoing emergency. So if you're in an affected area, and I know some of our speakers are, please prioritise your own well-being and your safety. If you need to leave, even if you're a speaker, please don't hesitate to do so. We understand, and I just want to acknowledge the range of experiences and needs going on around the motu right now and inside this room, and also the range of different and valid ways that we can offer help and take action. So we're going to kick off in a couple of seconds with our first speaker, but they'll just give you a quick rundown of how this evening's going to go. We're going to, we've got some really great speakers lined up who are going to speak from a variety of perspectives, and we're going to share with you some ways that you can support those in Tāmaki Makaurau from afar if you are able, and then also some ways that you can support climate action in the more kind of direct action way, if that's your jam. And we also are lucky enough to have a climate psychotherapist with us today who's going to just give us a few tips about trauma and resilience and take us through. We're going to go through a group exercise together. So without further ado, it's a real honour to introduce our first speaker, Golriz Ghahraman. Many of us know Golriz in one way or another. Iranian-born New Zealand politician, Green Party Member of Parliament. Golriz is a human rights activist and author, human rights lawyer, activist and author, former United Nations lawyer. Golriz came to New Zealand when she was 9 years old as an asylum seeker, and she's the first refugee elected to New Zealand's Parliament. It's a real honour to have you, Golriz.
Kia ora, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karangatanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm really, really grateful for your courage in holding this space right now. I think my first tweet, because that's how we live now, at the first signs that the water was getting to flooding levels was about climate crisis. And I know that even for me as a Green MP, I had to just for a moment hesitate and go, you know, the attacks are going to come about politicizing a disaster, and then kind of going, no, actually, this is exactly when we need to talk about it and hold the space, because actually it's been decades. The modeling is really, really clear. The predictions have been clear. The solutions have been clear. And so if we don't hold the space now as people are suffering, that, you know, that's on us, and it will be a lack of courage. So I'm really, really grateful that this isn't only a transport and rail forum, but we're talking about climate issues and we're putting the floods into perspective. And I'm really also grateful that you've captured in your intro the valid and varied experiences that we're having, because of course Tāmaki Makaurau is having sort of an existential crisis experience right on the back of our COVID experience, which was pretty unsettling. And I think you know, that mental health aspect is still there, and we're having a very cellular, visceral response that's tapping back into the COVID crisis. And for me especially, I come to this table, as you've said, as a refugee, as you know, migrant of color, as a woman, as a Green MP, but also as an immunocompromised person, and that weaves into the flood responses as well. So we're all kind of trying to support that community, knowing that if they have to evacuate, they're going to be really nervous about the lack of isolation for, you know, all of the things, right? So yes, the modeling has been clear. Yes, this is climate change. Yes, this is no longer something that we can describe as a 1 in a 100 years crisis. We do need different language to describe extreme weather, because these things are going to happen again and again. And for in terms of my work's focus, I sit on the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, and at the moment we're doing an inquiry into overfishing and illegal fishing in the Pacific. So we have to keep looking at the Pacific, and that fisheries inquiry is a climate inquiry, because actually we live in a Pacific where the warming oceans mean that fish stocks look really different, and people's access to the sea looks really different, and villages are being moved, and cemeteries are being dug up and moved to maintain and secure those communities and the cultural links. Like, we are in the middle of a crisis, in particular because we're in the middle of the Pacific. And I think we've got a lot to learn from the COVID response, which in New Zealand was by and large, you know, pretty successful. So the idea, and I think I take two ideas, and I think we all can say that we can take two really big ideas from the COVID response that worked really well. And the first was that we learned that with an existential societal-wide crisis, none of us are actually going to be okay unless all of us are okay. So the response has to take into account inequality and these different experiences. And the second one is that the response has to be systemic. We need people to take individual action, absolutely, but people can't take the mass scale individual actions that we need everyone to take without systemic support and resource. That's because our systems and resourcing models have for many, many years incentivized and supported different actions. So yes, we need everyone to switch into using sustainable public transport, for example, or eat in a sustainable way, or insulate their homes or build homes in a sustainable and intensified way. But can everyone do that in a world where we have for many, many years incentivized car travel, the whatever hectare it is housing that we all kind of ascribe to in this big sprawling city with backyards. And can we really ask low-income families to buy sustainably made goods when we know that our manufacturing practices are the things that need to be regulated for sustainability? So we need to subsidize these behaviors in the same way that we subsidize staying at home during COVID in this kind of unprecedented way when we needed to, and everyone's lives and livelihoods were on the line. We need to tax polluters to put that money back into the system. We need to acknowledge that we've in fact been subsidizing polluters. These things are, you know, they're known to us. The manufacturing practices being broken, the car incentivized roading resource, all of these things are really known to us. And the idea of climate justice then kind of bubbles up for me, whether it's the Pacific, whether it's public transport, whether it's including agriculture in our emissions schemes. But I think also we've kind of got some things to celebrate in Aotearoa, which is, for example, that we now have at least a scheme in law in the Zero Carbon Act. I was about to call it a bill because we campaigned on it for so long. So we have in law the acknowledgement that we need to set up an independent climate commission. We've now got an independent climate commission, and the acknowledgement there again, and I hope what leads to that kind of systemic change, it's already begun, is that we say, actually, it's every part of government that needs to be responsible for this. It actually is every part of government that needs to be assessed and to report back their climate emissions commitments, and in terms of very real change. So whether it's the Ministry for Health or Education, just like with COVID, the response can't come from, you know, one lip service paying ministry or minister or whatever, because we know in government that can happen, and the responsibility can't be shouldered by one person alone. It's quite nice to see the Ministry for Defence, for example, have to show up and say why they need these insane war-making vessels in order to mostly just do environmental monitoring and search and rescue in the Pacific. So they need to be a climate ministry in their own right. In terms of sustainable transport, I think it's really, really important that we kind of do turn our minds to the idea that we have for many years said, you know, we need to actually control the way that we emit because it's changing the climate, and changing the climate means that we're going to have crazy flooding. But the idea of doing that for 10 years and then doing the mitigation work for 10 years is gone. We need to do it together. These things need to happen at the same time now. We need to mitigate the impacts of climate change at the same time as we prevent the worst of the impacts from happening. So yes, we need to lower our emissions. Yes, we need a different way of transporting ourselves and our cities in order to do that. But we also need to make those changes because we can't live in cities that flood in this way anymore. So it's extra incentive, I hope that the people who have for many years talked about prioritizing business or personal property or whatever, yes, important. We don't want that to fall away. People have to live. But actually the idea that sustainability means protecting those things as well is starting to come up with these floods. You know, the idea that inequality is hurting all of us, no matter the way that it, you know, that it impacts our daily lives. It's actually going to come into now a broader existential crisis. So, you know, to have passenger trains between our provincial centres and Auckland, Christchurch and Wellington, you know, might become more of a thing that people think about. Building cities in a way that includes big green spaces to take in this water. Having you know, our mayor recently talked about Wellington's preparedness for earthquakes. Well, you know, building better, building with solar, building in an intensified way, but with materials that actually take these things and these crises into account, becomes more of a we're all in it together solution. So I guess the idea of and I met really in the last couple of years, I met with the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, and he'd taken it upon himself to issue a climate change report, because he even could see that his mandate crossed over too much to ignore this with climate crisis, and the idea that he called it a climate apartheid was going to develop is right there. So I guess the main message from these floods is that the crisis is universal, it's urgent, and it is inextricably linked to inequality as well as the environment. So we need systemic solutions. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. It was really inspiring, and I really think it's so important for us to be able to draw together that all of these issues and portfolio areas are all interconnected. If one is failing, it's all failing, and where one person is suffering, we all are. We just can't think about this as entirely as individuals. I wanted to I'm going to drop them into the chat. I'm not very good at multitasking. There are loads of ways that if we are not in Tāmaki Makaurau, or even if we are, and we've got some capacity to support, there are lots of places that you can donate to, and I'll drop some of the numbers into the chat in a second. There's Acts of Roskill Kindness, Ngā Whare Wātea Food Bank in Mangere, Care Waitakere Food Bank. So I'm going to drop the bank account numbers of those places into the chat now. And I've got a few more ideas for you down the line as well. I would love to introduce our next speaker, Catherine Murupaenga-Ikenn. Catherine hails from Te Arawa in Ngāti Kurī. Catherine has been an Indigenous activist for most of her adult life, working on human rights, including environmental, social, economic, and climate justice. She has held numerous positions with the UN, and her passion lies in Indigenous technical expert and traditional knowledges, wisdom, and practices. Over to you, Catherine.
Kia ora. He mihi mahana ki a koutou e whakaronga mai nei, ki tēnei whakawhiti kōrero. And thank you to the organisers, and I'm also looking forward to hearing the other panellists as well speak. I also wanted to pay my respects to Whaia Tutuwhai Harawira, who passed away this week, just gone. You know, a big theme is leadership. You know, there's a generation of staunch leadership which is disappearing, and we need to regenerate that and be radically obedient to standards, you know, the highest standards, to get us through this coming period. It's not just coming, it's here. And I just want to acknowledge Golriz, because she's actually touched on a lot of issues that I was going to raise. So in listening to this, I invite people to see where the junctures are and the reinforcement of messaging is, because I'm looking at it from a high level perspective, but wanting to translate that to action on the ground, to inspire us to do something on the ground. The UN has a disaster risk response mechanism. It's called the Senadai framework. I wouldn't encourage you to go off and look at it because it's very high level, but it does, you know, it guides governments as to how they should deal with climate crisis in any disaster scenario. Yes, because of climate crisis, but also because of other interrelated, potentially existential threats to humanity. And I'm thinking here of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who have this thing called the Doomsday Clock, right? And this month, they set that clock at 90 seconds to midnight. That is bad. That's the worst it's ever been. And this signals like, major combined threats, most notably crisis of climate, obviously, but nuclear war triggered, for example, by the Ukraine conflict, and the failure of global norms and institutions to address risks like artificial intelligence is an emerging big risk, and geoengineering and other sorts of potentially disruptive technologies, many of which are advanced as a response to climate crisis, by the way. Techno-fixing our way out of it is not how we're going to get through this sucker. And also biological threats like pandemics. And so what this says is, and Golriz will know what I'm talking about here, governance as it stands has failed, okay? In Aotearoa, but all around the world, this is an admission, that is being made in international circles, okay? Citizens' trust in institutions is at an all-time low around the globe, and for good reason. We can't rely on the body politic to effectively plan and mobilize to protect our citizens. There exists a level of corruption in the state, which is driving human civilization into steep decline, and the proof of that is all around us. If you need proof, just look around. So, but by corruption, I don't necessarily mean elected officials are dishonest or biased, although there certainly is that with some bureaucrats, but there might also be inept or incompetent politicians or their departmental officials, giving bad advice, misinformation on what government policies are then designed on and rolled out, implemented in that way, designed and implemented badly. There's also corruption at a systemic level, and Golriz mentioned, the systemic problem facing us, how the state system, it's made up of the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. It's dysfunctional to a critical degree. It's just not functioning in the interests of we the people. It's definitely functioning in the interests of some other agendas, but not we the people for, a large chunk of its functioning. And I know tangata whenua for sure know what I'm talking about in terms of the destruction of our taonga, like different indigenous species and habitats, and in the systemic transfer of Māori wealth to the state, to corporations, and throughout history to mainstream populations. This is that inequity that Golriz talked about, right? When we have this inequity entrenched in society, you're going to have this, imbalance of power and in decision making in particular, which is why the decision making goes all topsy-turvy, and we get to these sorts of places in this time, in this age that humanity finds ourselves in. So we have to address colonization, patriarchy, and like many indigenous peoples, Māori, our lands, our marine areas, our territories, our resources, that we've become sacrifice zones, quite frankly, for others' interests. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, Māori have often said to mainstream society, stand with us, stand beside us, stand with us, help us preserve, salvage what is left and recover and hit that standard of human rights protection, because once they take everything about, they're not even going to wait to take everything Māori have. They'll come for yours, whatever you have. And I'm talking about corporations as well, especially corporations. I know we've heard this before, but the sacrifice zones are made with catch cries like, it's in the best interest of the nation, or the best interest of the economy. The economy's got to keep pumping, got to do it this way. Business and industry. This is a particularly disaster capitalistic world we're living in. It has to change. The model systemically has to change. And there are plenty of models out there now that we can look to for inspiration. Okay. So, there's no excuses for us to sort of go, what is the way forward? With a bit of research, with a bit of like applying our intellect and focus, we can imagine what that great reset, but a people's great reset would look like. Not the World Economic Forum's great reset, the people's great reset. It's about a democracy that is a te treaty-based democracy, an Aotearoan elected, undemocratic influence of corporations and such on our governments, you know, because that's what we have now. So I also want to do a hat tip to this idea about defense and the military industrial complex. What the doomsday clock also points to is the impact of the military industrial complex, especially in the context of major conflicts, which our so-called state leaders are apparently impotent to dampen down. And you might say, what has that got to do with climate crisis? Well, I'm sorry to say, if people aren't aware, the inconvenient truth is there is no accurate accounting at best. At worst, there is absolutely no accounting for the emissions of the military industrial complexes, greenhouse gases in their activities, as well as that, the ultimate damage they do to the natural world is undermining all our efforts to regenerate the environment, all these, meteorological high all undermining very what would otherwise be effective action to heal our climate. And lastly, of course, the trillions of dollars that goes into these proxy wars, these false flag wars, these wars which are basically a cover for corporations to go in and then colonize a very vulnerable country while it's down. I mean, people, we've got to somehow raise the consciousness of society so that they understand when there's a war, lift the veil, look at what's really going on. It's not about righteousness, fundamentally. A lot of the time, it's about just snaffling the resources, grabbing the lands of other countries, their resources, for empire building and imperialism. Okay, so we've got to be very careful about when we're defending these kinds of campaigns. We've got to get our facts straight. I'm talking about the Ukraine war. There's more to it than most people believe. And Russia's been forced into a position by the NATO states, I would say. So this calls for campaigns of peace. This is something that as people we can do. What are we going to do? We need to campaign more radically for peace in the empire building and the corporate colonization that goes on. We need also to build democracy, and at a citizen level, that means we have to seriously prioritize constitutional work in this country. We need a te tiriti and he whakaputanga based constitutional transformation process, and we need it fast. We could also do other things like hold these te tiriti people's, assemblies, because we've got to hold the governors to account because they're failing us, right? The 16 and 17-year-old campaign for the vote, that we should do. If you don't know why that is important and critical, I encourage you to go do your research and find out why those young people not only deserve the vote, but when they will vote in a way that is more aligned with healing and nurturing and life, life supporting policies. And ask yourself, how networked is your community? And I'm also talking here about the community of the Pacific, because we've got all these refugees, as Golriz said, but we've got domestic refugees. We know that, communities having to and move. There are, we have to figure out how we're going to do this in a methodical and a just and fair way. Okay, so I think I've spoken enough, but happy to take some questions and look forward to the rest of the webinar. Kia ora. Thanks, Ray.
Oh, kia ora, Catherine. That's so inspiring. And I think that thinking about climate refugees, whether they are domestic climate refugees or from our neighbours, is something that we really should be planning for. I wanted to draw attention to a campaign that I know Catherine is working on at the moment with one of the groups that she is part of, Te Waka Haurua, working on this campaign for quite a while to get Te Papa, our place, to tell the truth about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, to represent this properly. So I'm just going to chuck the name of that campaign into the chat, and you can look them up on Facebook. And I think we'll maybe send out an email with all of the links to the stuff that we're referencing tonight. So moving along to our next wonderful speaker. Oh, I also wanted to, I know some people like animals more than they like humans. This amazing organisation is up in Tāmaki Makaurau, Kuha, they are called, Helping You Help Animals. So if they're doing a lot of good rescue work on the farms, got some trailers up there removing cattle and things. So if that's more your jam, you can text Hoo-ha 4463, and that makes a $3 donation to support animals who are suffering in this flooding also. Our next speaker is Sophie. Sophie is a regenerative farmer, composter and activist working in Tāmaki Makaurau. As part of Fridays for Future, she contributes to organising the climate strikes across Aotearoa, and she also runs a teaching farm, educating young people about food systems. Over to you, Sophie.
Kia ora, everybody. Wow, I'm just extremely jacked up, basically, from the previous two kōreros. What amazing, amazing to hear you both. Yeah, incredible to be on a panel with you two. And yeah, I really want to just honor what space and energy we're holding here, because of how much stress and suddenness Auckland's feeling changed. And I feel though as activists, we're kind of always going from one campaign to the next, you know, with Pūtiki and everything. Golriz, you were saying, like, oh, they're digging up graves. And I'm like thinking, yeah, well, Pūtiki's getting a car park on endangered penguin nesting grounds. You know, like, you're always doing things. But when everyone else gets with you on that and starts going, wow, it's really happening, then sometimes it can really raise the energy a lot in the space. So yeah, I just want to thank you for calling this and for making a space for us to speak about climate change, and how it is really the summary of all issues of everything that's gone wrong. Is the result is what we're experiencing now. So yeah, when we talk about constitutional reform, I just think of natural law, because when you start having rain around you and it's washing everything past and the water's rising up, you're not thinking about what's legal, you're thinking about whatever you're going to do to survive. And that's really the reality of climate change. Is we really, as a humanity, I guess, need to see that it right in fucking front of us, that this corporate colonization is killing our humanity, and the planet will wipe us out if we kill our humanity. So yeah, that's why I think what I was really coming up in your talk, Catherine, was what we value as a nation, what we hold, you know, what we hold dear to us, what we're aiming for, what we're building. And yeah, I think even though we're in these crises, I do feel like we have to keep imagining that better dream and that better world and how we contribute to it. One example is, like, I've been feeling pretty helpless lately in a couple of ways, but I've managed to find some native tree seedlings that were available, and I took them down to my park and planted them out. And I've just been coming down there and tending them, and just acknowledging that that is not legal. That's actually the revolution that we have to do is not legal. You know, what we have to be stepping up to fight climate action. Because the policies and the laws that are set in place have been set in place by something as democracy that that isn't actually true. You know, it's hard to think of the floods in Auckland and not look to who our supposed leader was, Wayne Brown, and that, but only 15% of Aucklanders voted Wayne Brown in. We have a democratic crisis. Like, most people I know are like, why the fuck do we have a turd as our mayor? But, you know, like, they didn't vote. So we're not engaging in that process, and that process isn't working. And even in the activist space, and when you are engaging with that and you're going and doing these consultations, they're really not accessible. And the way that feedback in those is structured is in such a way that, you know, it's just not quite capturing the essence of what it is we're all saying here, which is that we need to be regenerating the earth, holding her dear to us, and having a relationship with our natural world, and moving about this space without thinking we're this character that's the main character here to live life and to live at large. Like if you say climate activism, but you dream of these fast cars and big jewels and private jets, and you kind of get on down on that, then like, you know, what are you really for? So we need to think about what we value, what we are wanting to build. What kind of life are you going to build that's a climate resilient life? What kind of world are you going to live in that's a climate resilient world? You know, like a shaded walkway of fruit trees to get to school, you know, literally start dreaming of these things you can't imagine now. Imagine if in today's society, someone proposed libraries, like free internet, cool place to hang out, ping pong tables, and free knowledge, just all this information for free. Like people would be like, what? You know, that's the way we've built this world, where we have to pay for everything and it has to be hard, and we have to work in the little slave bot system in order to feed ourselves and live on this earth. And we don't actually need to do that. You know, I had the privilege recently of going to a farm and making a harvest of stuff from my farm, and I was really impressed with how the biodiversity in my farm space was not impacted by the flood so much as I thought. I was worried, you know, but when I got down there, because there's a lot of biodiversity in my farm, the water had flowed through and had seeped in quite quickly because of the different root systems. And we have flood in Auckland right now, and we have 90% wetland loss in Aotearoa. And you know, we are literally currently right now, they're building another highway over a wetland in Tāmaki to do more oil. So, you know, we need to be standing up. Well, I don't know actually how long I have to speak for, so feel free to interject me. I could go on. But yeah, democratic crisis, we need to control industry. And we've signed up as a nation to the Paris Agreement. You know, we are liable to take action, but yet the law, we have like schemes, we have frameworks and guidelines in government, but where is the law saying, you know, you can't be an abuser and abuse this world to make money? There's so many amazing ways to make money, even if you want to be a capitalist. You know, we can all be free and have our values, but that aren't just destroying and destructing this planet. So, you know, vote. And also, how do we lower the voting age? Yes. How do we get more of that? How do we protect our spaces that are under threat right now? You know, because I love like City Rail, like Link, and all the things like under construction in Auckland. We have trains coming, and I'm hoping that it's going to be a lot better for us. But like, there's land that's under attack, and I'm just like, yeah, as an activist, it feels like the flood is just kind of representing to me how I feel like there's just so many issues coming up. So yeah, it's an emotional time, and in Auckland we feel it because we've concreted everything, and so that water moved fast. And I hope everyone got a rude awakening, and I'd prefer less of a surprise shower from Papatuanuku and Ranganui, but yeah, it's emotional to be speaking on this topic when you walk down and see trash in the gutter that flows to the sea, and you know, we can go out there and pick it up, and so often we numb ourselves to not do that because it's inappropriate to be doing that all the time, and it is really everywhere. but it does make you really just want to encourage more people just to go, what in the day-to-day can we be doing? But at the end of the day, you know, Coca-Cola, it's all got the same bit of trash as Coca-Cola. You know, what we're facing is the same shit that we're dealing with, which is the corporate control and colonization and the way that they've infiltrated this system to make it completely, the people are just here to provide the labor for the system, and the system is this big beast that we can't overcome. No, we're way better than that as a species. Like I'm a creative person. I don't want to live in a machine. That's me.
Kia ora, Sophie. Thank you so much. I think that's such a beautiful reminder to really live a life of values, and it can be quite easy to think these are my values, but a few more steps, a bit harder to really kind of dig in and make some of those really tough changes and change those habits and live those values. And that was a beautiful reminder that that's what we
I just want to add one thing.
Yes, sure.
Of course, Fridays for Future, all of us are similar situation, young people having these kind of climate meltdowns all the time, but supporting one another. And we are having a strike, global climate strike, on March 3rd, and it's actually going to be in quite a few cities around Aotearoa, so I hope everyone's aware of that. And if you're not aware of it and haven't shared it to your friends, please go and share about the global climate strike, because we're just trying to stand up because we want to live a better world, and we know you guys all do too if you're tuning into this.
Yep, there'll be more about the climate strike coming up. Thanks, Sophie. Our next speaker is Naomi, joining us from Lismore in Australia. She lived in Lismore during the flooding and took some direct actions in the aftermath of that flooding. Naomi's a climate activist with Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies, which is the partner campaign to restore passenger rail. And Naomi's community organiser with the Lismore Environment Centre, allied health worker, and now working in community flood recovery. Over to you, Naomi.
Well, thanks for having me. I can't promise I won't get a bit emotional, because it's been a huge event, and I feel I'm actually born in New Zealand, and so I feel very sad about the floods, but it's what's happening in these times. So on the 28th of February 2022, we'd had about 3 days of rain. We had about 600 millimeters in our upper catchment in about 2 days. So we were looking at some serious flooding coming down our catchment. So I went downtown. The CBD's right near the river. I went downtown to clear out the Environment Centre with some Environment Centre friends, and we got out our computer and our stuff, our shop supplies and things, and took them to higher ground. And then I went home and thought, oh, well, okay, there's a flood coming. I'm in the basin on the city side of the river, and the north and south are not included in the levee wall. So I was at home that evening, aware of the potential for flooding, and there was a text message from the State Emergency Services saying, oh, well, you know, at 6 p.m. the waters might overtop the levee, and please think about evacuating at about 6 a.m. And I thought, oh, well, you know, all the houses in Lismore, so 90% or more of the houses in Lismore actually made 100+ years ago from the beautiful old forests that used to be around. So they're made with solid hardwood timber with hardwood floors. That being said, it's actually a lower socioeconomic area to live in the flood zone, because the backyards tend to get flooded every few years. But this one I thought, oh, the yard's going to fill with water. We're not sure what's happening. And then the 8 o'clock State Emergency Service message came. Oh, yes, it's going to overtop the levee and you should get out by 5 a.m. So at that point, I grabbed my friend and packed a few more things into a backpack. We'd already taken our cars up the hill and parked them out of the zone. And we walked over to a friend's house. We had to wade out over a creek that had already flooded and passed a restless night and got up, and the town was full of water. And I was shocked in coming days to find that many of my neighbours had been clinging to the gutter by dawn. They were actually, so there was 4 or 5 meters of water from the street level was in the town. And it was quite quick. People had water coming into the house at 2, 3 a.m. And people in North and South Lismore were calling police and the SES saying, there's water coming in the house, what do I do? And the SES said, it's too late for us to help you. Get up on your tables, get up on your wardrobes, get higher into your roof spaces. And it ended up that people, locals and many, even people who were holidaying on the coast with boats, put their boats down, got in the water by dawn. Some, an Aboriginal man I know got in the water at about 3 a.m. and they were going around, and they even had to sometimes rip off the roofing iron and get people out from the inside of their roofs. In my street, there was a business that does wetland regeneration, and they kayaked in at dawn to go and check their servers and realized they had to kayak out and rescue people. They went and got a boat, came back and rescued the whole street. Yeah, it was very, very terrifying and scary. I'm glad I rescued myself, and we got up, and my friend went straight down to the water and started helping people out of the water, ended up on a boat. And the river was so forceful that you either had to be in a boat on one side rescuing people and bringing them out that side, or you had to be on the other side and rescuing people and taking them to the west. So that was going on. There were helicopters. Nothing was ever the same ever again. Yeah, it's been a huge journey. There was no power. Some of the phones, some people's phones still had reception, some people's didn't. So even though we might have gone into, it took about 3 days for the water to go down and for us to get back to the house and find out. It's like the mud comes in, and it's like a washing machine, and all your wardrobes have fallen over, because in my particular case, the water went to the ceiling. So it meant that anything was just moved around by the water and mungled up together and covered in mud and stench. So that was, but at the same time, there was no hot water where I was staying. So we were going in there and trying to muck out and then coming home and having to rinse off with cold water. And there was no fuel. We had to queue. First time I've ever had to queue for fuel after a few days. A supermarket, there was one supermarket left in town, and that got emptied up pretty quick. So it felt like the apocalypse. But Lismore's a very connected place. Like, it's true of quite demographic is that there are a lot of people on government payments. There's a lot of disability support services, a lot of people with disabilities, and also a lot of activists. So there was already existing networks where people just straight away went to help each other and check on each other, and all that sort of mutual aid type thing. Yeah, but lots of terrifying stories, lots of crying together, and lots of filthy mud. So yes. So after the flood, I had only the clothes I packed in my overnight bag and my toothbrush, and we just went down and tried to, well, we were a bit in shock. Everyone was in shock, and contacting friends and finding out what was going on. So yeah, I think it takes a while to get over the noise of helicopters being a threatening thing. And I went to a workshop today about disaster recovery and working in disaster recovery. And it's it's a 2-year to 5-year process. When I certainly myself was running on adrenaline for months and months after the flood. We had a community group that we'd started up in one of the previous big floods, and we stood that up and we started offering help. And I ended up starting up a group that would go out and volunteer to help people either demolish their walls and put new walls back up. So I was leading gyprocking teams, even though the closest thing I'd done to construction work was working on farms. If you have a little bit of practical skill, you can put up gyprock. So we were doing that. We're still doing that at Resilient Lismore, helping people, especially disadvantaged people, to put up walls in their homes as a part of a rebuild process. Yeah. So is there any questions? No.
Yeah, I think we won't take questions right now. It's a bit difficult in a large group. Thank you so much, Naomi. I think something I was hearing from what you said is that these events are terrible for everyone, and they also don't kind of, the impact is more for some sectors of society. There are people who don't have insurance, who just the recovery from this is so much more than, you know, if you're kind of well resourced, it's still terrible, but you know there's going to be some help down the line somewhere. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I'm just going to drop in the chat another amazing place to donate to. This has an 0800 number you can call to get the details to donate to Roa Pōtaka Marae. So I'm just going to drop that into the chat, and again we'll somehow get all of these links and details to you after the call. So we'll keep things moving. I'm going to introduce Michael Apáthy next, Ōtautahi-based psychotherapist and climate activist. Michael works in the Restore Passenger Rail campaign and with Aotearoa Climate Psychology Alliance. Over to you, Michael.
Kia ora koutou, ko Michael Apáthy tōku ingoa no Ōtautahi Christchurch aho. Yeah, great to be able to just be here together, connected in this, and you know, it's such an intense thing that I think we're holding together, and even just the kōrero that we've already heard. So wow, what times we're living in. Just wanted to acknowledge as well this thread that's been through the kōrero so far. A number of people have mentioned you know, refugees, the displacement, just how, you know, moving that is for me as the son of a refugee, and, you know, as one of the big drivers for my connection to climate action. So I think what we're going through brings the refugee experience more to mind and closer to more of us. Right, so yeah, for myself, I'm a climate justice activist with the Restore Passenger Rail campaign, but I'm not really speaking about that tonight, more kind of having my hat on as a psychotherapist and ecotherapist. Yeah, acknowledging that there'll be so many different impacts from this flooding, let alone the bigger climate disasters that we can expect in the future. So just, you know, acknowledging all of those impacts. But for my brief time with you, I'll be speaking on the mental health impacts. So from these sorts of events, we know that the mental impacts can be massive and long-lived. So I practice psychotherapy here in Ōtautahi, where the quakes, as we all know, have, you know, profoundly affected people's mental health. And, you know, acknowledging that these climate floods, they're not the same as the quakes, that, you know, I think they're different in that they're actually more psychologically complex and difficult to deal with, because with these floods, in some sort of way, we're all implicated, you know, because we all, you know, are involved in the system. We all, you know, contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. That said, of course, some of us are contributing far more to this crisis than others. But this is really psychologically complex because, you know, it's not a natural disaster. As you know, I'm probably speaking to the converted when I say this, that you know, what this is it's a betrayal of the most vulnerable in society, in our society, by the most powerful. So this is different than the Quakes, but there's similarities too. And sometimes people from other towns or countries ask me about practicing mental health here in Aotearoa, and often they expect that with the traumatized population here, I'll be spending lots of time talking with people in the therapy room about the Quakes. And actually, I very rarely do that. The reason for that is that what often needs to be dealt with from a mental health perspective is the strain and the breakdown in relationships, the relational dislocations. And just to say that in a bit more plain language, that could be, you know, parents who, with the best of intentions, during and after the Quakes, weren't able to give their children what they needed emotionally because the parents were overwhelmed themselves. You know, stories of friendships, you know, marriages getting stressed, breaking down, people becoming alienated from each other and actually alienated from themselves. So I'm talking about the mental health impact of these disasters and about trauma, really. But sometimes I ask myself, well, what does that word trauma really mean? Because it's a word that in you know, these days can be thrown around kind of lightly. Trauma doesn't mean getting very upset. Sometimes very upsetting things happen and then we feel it, and then after that we get to go on with our lives feeling perfectly healthy and okay. So that's not trauma. Trauma affects our capacity to relate to ourselves and each other's in an ongoing way. Trauma affects the way we react automatically, and that might be with kind of excessive reactions like panic, for instance, or that might be through reacting almost like too little. So it could be like kind of going numb or dissociative, for instance. Something that we know very clearly about trauma by now is that people can go through the same event and some of them will be traumatized by it and other people will be upset but not actually traumatized. So so why is that? The thing that's most protective against trauma is having deep, intimate, healthy relationships. We know this, the evidence is overwhelming for that. We're talking about attachment, really. So trauma unfortunately amplifies inequities in our society because people who lack those relationships, those deep, intimate, healthy relationships, particularly people who lack them early on in their life, are more vulnerable to trauma. They're more likely to be traumatized more through the rest of their lives. So that's a really awful thing. That's an unfair, unjust thing. But the flip side of that is that also we know very clearly that healthy and caring relationships can help to heal trauma, and they can build up our collective and individual resilience. And that's, you know, that's not necessarily something complicated. I think it's something that we all know on some level. Yeah, it's about us showing up and listening to each other with care and lack of judgment. So what we're talking about is relationships or experiences of unconditional care. Yeah, so I care for you as a person just for being yourself. Yeah, so it's care that's not conditional. It's not that you have to do something to be worthy of care. Yeah, it's unconditional. That's that kind of security, emotional, psychological safety that is so protective against trauma, and helps us heal from trauma. So it's the lack of judgments. And that's something that we can all offer to each other and to ourselves. And it's something that we can build up and develop as a capacity, as a skill. Yeah. So I don't know, but I'm guessing that most of us in this call right now are not in a flooded area. But despite that, we are all affected, we are all touched by this one way or another, whether we're connected to that and realize that or not. And further or more, we're all, you know, resourced emotionally with that sense of care and connection. The better we're resourced with that sense of care and connection, the better that we're able to take care practically and emotionally of people who are at the forefront of this disaster, the most vulnerable people. Not just talking about today, but in the weeks and the months and the years to come. We know this from the Christchurch quakes, from many other disasters, that this is a long haul thing.
There are so many ways to support climate action. The neighbourhood and community cleanup efforts following these climate disaster events, that's all climate action that people are engaged in right now. There's all that great stuff that we do as individuals to reduce our carbon footprint, and we know these are necessary and they are not enough to make the difference that we need fast enough. We need systemic change. And I'm really delighted to introduce Aurora Garner. Aurora is a 16-year-old climate activist based in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. She's been organising school strikes for climate for the last 3 years. And Aurora's going to talk to us a little bit about one of the more kinds of direct action kind of type of things that you can do.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Kia ora, everyone. I'm really honoured to have been given the privilege to close off this meeting after we've heard from some really qualified and passionate activists. So thanks for that. I'm 16 years old and I'm an organiser for the Ōtautahi branch of School Strike for Climate. I've been doing climate activism for a couple of years now, like Rach said, mobilising students to strike for climate action. We've got a global climate strike coming up soon, which I will talk about in a minute. But when Michael invited me to talk on this call, he suggested that I talk a little about my perspective as a young climate activist. And I've been thinking about that and what being a young person gaining political consciousness during the climate crisis has been like. So I'm going to talk about that for a couple of minutes. For some of you here, you've been able to watch as the climate science became more clear and as the effects of climate change took hold. Some of you would have been around to watch the IPCC form and put out its first reports, and later the Kyoto Protocol be released and come into effect, or to witness Al Gore's election campaign efforts. And I think it must have been horrifying to watch the climate science come into focus with the predictions of temperature rise, extreme weather events, floodings, droughts, and to watch our world leaders and our capitalist economic system fail to rise to the challenge. From listening to elder climate activists, I know that some of you have been protesting since the alarm bells first began to ring, and you've kept going since. And you inspire me, and I hope that I'll keep fighting for the planet my whole life too. But the experience of my generation has been different from yours. We didn't get to watch in horror as the tidal wave of the climate emergency began to form. We gained political consciousness in time to look up and see it barreling towards us. And there's a unique terror, I think, as a child, to begin to learn about climate change, to look at your parents' generation, your teachers, the politicians and businessmen that run the world that you've been born into, and ask, what do you mean? You've known about this emergency that threatens every part of this earth that we live on, and you've done what about it? Next to nothing. For my generation, news of the climate emergency is all we have ever known. However, the generation that I fear for the most is the one just below me. That's the group that wasn't even afforded the decency to begin to comprehend the words climate change before it has begun to shape their lives. Children in Auckland who have had their right to shelter, to safety and security ripped away from them by the floods. People have died. Children have lost loved ones to the climate crisis before they even know what the climate crisis is. But this isn't the way it has to be. The storm of the climate crisis may well be in motion, but we cannot let each other drown. We have to weather this storm. We've got to keep fighting to keep our planet afloat. If you're not sick of this ocean metaphor yet, we have to fight against those who want to live in their super yachts and are content to let everyone else flounder. And I'm probably already preaching to the choir when I say that a capitalist economy, neoliberal economic policies, moderate climate action, these things will not save us. I'm I'm probably preaching to the choir in this meeting if I advocate for equity, for sustainable cities and transport, for radical protection of our land and ocean now. We all know that these things are what will mitigate climate disaster. What we need to do is everything in our power to fight for these goals. We need to keep protesting, keep voting, keep disrupting, keep doing more, because we have no other choice if we care about our future. So before I wrap up, I'd like to tell you quickly about the global climate strike coming up on the 3rd of March. We're trying to get climate organizations all over Aotearoa participating in this action, trying to get it a huge coordinated event. Not just School Strike for Climate. So the call is open. If you want to help out, get in contact with me, get in contact with your local School Strike for Climate branch, and we want to make this as big as possible. As the climate emergency gets more and more dire, we need to be stepping up our numbers, we need to be stepping up the radical action in our protests. So please help us advertise. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, spread the word and be there on the 3rd, sharpen the streets for us, because we need to keep stepping up our action. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Aurora. That was amazing. It's something I think about just daily, really. I feel so sorry. It's not an adequate word, but yeah, just like I'm so sorry for what we have failed to achieve, I guess. I've got 3 baby grandchildren. I just watch them playing in their innocence and feel so glad that they can have that for a moment. So climate strike, March the 3rd, we'll send the details. And I think I'll just send a big email with all of the links to everyone and how you can join these things. And I'm just going to give you our last little thing before I let you go, is to tell you about Restore Passenger Rail. So while this sounds like a train campaign, and it is a train campaign, it's also it's ostensibly a climate campaign, and we're using this really popular demand to we think restoring passenger rail throughout the country from bottom to top and across to the coast is a really great way of future-proofing for the many generations to come. Might not give us our biggest emissions reduction bang, but it's a really important piece of infrastructure. And also just to build this idea that we have power, like we have power, we can together get things done. So we have got an introduction talk to Restore Passenger Rail campaign, and where you can learn a little bit about civil resistance. That's on Thursday night at 7 p.m. and you can find that on our Facebook page. And again, I'll send out a big email with the places you can donate to to help out in Tāmaki Makaurau. You can also find there's masses of places you can find online to help out. And if you're in Tāmaki and have got the capacity to go and help out, you can find all of this stuff. The spin-off has actually a really great article listing all of these places. So I just want to thank all of our speakers for your time and energy and passion, and for everything that you do in this fight for life on this beautiful planet. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. I'll just close us out with a karakia. Mō tēnei wā manakatia mai mā katoa o mātou hoa o mātou whānau ai o ki te aorangi. Kia ora. Thanks, stay safe. I know there's still red and orange warnings out there, so be safe, take care and be kind.
Thank you so much. We still have time, everybody. I feel like there's a big movement of everybody in Auckland being awoken by what's happened. So please keep shining your lights in your communities for climate action, but also for that better world that's really all those issues. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. See you.